Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
The story of the first high priest of Israel is one of those mysteries buried in the sands of history, where religion, politics, and cultural memory intertwine. We are taught to think of the Israelite priesthood as a purely Middle Eastern institution, centered in the desert lands of Sinai and later in Jerusalem. Yet when one begins to peel away the layers of ancient tradition, linguistic clues, archaeological records, and overlooked African connections, a startling picture begins to emerge. This picture suggests that the earliest high priests of Israel, those who carried the weight of divine authority and mediated between God and man, were not merely desert wanderers. They were kings, rulers with both political and spiritual authority, whose origins lay deeply connected with Africa. The Old Testament itself begins this trail. Aaron, the brother of Moses, is declared the first high priest, the man through whom the sacred order of priesthood was consecrated. But Moses and Aaron's family were not an isolated tribe in the wilderness. They had been raised in the very heart of Africa, in Egypt. Egypt at the time was not simply a geographic neighbor to Israel. It was the most powerful empire of the ancient world, African in its soil, its traditions, and its rulers. Moses himself, adopted into Pharaoh's household, would have been trained in African royal courts, schooled in Egyptian wisdom, and initiated into traditions of kingship that blended religious authority with political sovereignty. When Aaron was appointed as high priest, it was not a foreign model of priesthood that he carried, but one deeply reflective of African kingship traditions. In Egyptian culture, kings were not merely political figures. They were divine intermediaries. The pharaohs ruled as both temporal leaders and high priests of the gods. They carried titles such as high priest of every temple, overseeing the sacrifices and ensuring divine favor for the land. This merging of kingship and priesthood in Africa provides a direct parallel to the way Israel's early leaders functioned. Before Israel had a monarchy, its priests carried royal authority. The high priest wore garments strikingly similar to Egyptian regalia, robes of fine linen, breastplates adorned with precious stones, a headdress with an inscribed plate of gold. These were not accidental similarities, but reflections of cultural and symbolic inheritance rooted in African traditions. Further evidence comes from the African lineage running through Israel's earliest leaders. Zipporah, the wife of Moses, is described as a Cushite, a woman of African descent. Cush, biblically connected with Nubia and the region south of Egypt, was known for its mighty kings and warrior priests. The marriage of Moses into this lineage ties the priestly household of Israel directly to African nobility. Later, during the reign of King Solomon, the Ethiopian connection reappears with the visit of the Queen of Sheba, cementing centuries-long interactions between Israel and Africa. But even before Solomon, the priesthood itself was already bound by ties of blood and heritage to African kingship. The very structure of the Levitical priesthood bears witness to its African origins. The Levites were set apart, a tribe without land inheritance, sustained by offerings and tithes. This mirrored African models where priestly kings ruled not by territorial ownership but by spiritual stewardship. In Cushite and Nubian societies, priests often held equal or even superior authority to kings, able to determine who could rule and under what conditions. The echoes of this system resound in Israel, where the high priest held immense influence, guiding the spiritual destiny of the nation, standing above kings in times of crisis, and bearing the sacred right to enter the Holy of Holies. Archaeology strengthens this case further. Studies of iconography, temple design, and ritual practices show a constant exchange between Egypt, Nubia, and the Levant. The Ark of the Covenant, centerpiece of Israelite worship, has striking parallels to African sacred chests used to house divine relics. The carrying poles, the cherubim figures, and the idea of divine presence dwelling within a portable throne all mirror African ritual objects. Even the incense rituals, sacrifices, and purification rites practiced by Israel had clear precedents in Egyptian temple life. These were not borrowed in a casual way, but carried forward as part of heritage in which Israel's first priests were raised. The biblical narratives themselves preserve faint but telling traces. When Miriam and Aaron criticized Moses for marrying an African woman, God rebuked them, underscoring the legitimacy of Moses' African connection. In prophetic texts, Israel is repeatedly reminded of its ties to Cush and Egypt, not merely as geographic neighbors but as intertwined peoples. The prophet Isaiah speaks of God's plan extending to Egypt and Cush, suggesting a shared divine heritage. This reflects a memory that the roots of Israel's religious leadership were not purely Semitic but Afro-Semitic, born of an intersection that cannot be separated. One of the most overlooked aspects of this history is the symbolism of kingship itself. In Africa, rulers were often anointed, clothed in divine garments, and marked with oil or blood to signify their consecration. The Hebrew high priest underwent the same process. He was anointed with sacred oil, clothed in garments symbolizing heavenly authority, and consecrated as one who bore the sins of the people. This was not simply a coincidence of ritual, but a continuation of African royal priestly traditions reframed within the covenant of Israel. The earliest high priests, like their African counterparts, were seen as bridges between earth and heaven. The memory of African kingship in Israel's priesthood would persist, though often obscured by later retellings. As the priesthood evolved in Jerusalem, and especially after the Babylonian exile, the narrative was reshaped to highlight its Israelite purity. Yet beneath the layers of rewriting, the traces remain: an Egyptian upbringing, a Cushite marriage, African regalia, and rituals echoing those of the Nile Valley. These threads weave together into a tapestry of proof that Israel's earliest high priests were, in essence, African kings. What emerges from this understanding is not a revision for its own sake, but a restoration of forgotten history. Africa was not peripheral to the biblical story. It was central. The first high priests of Israel did not emerge in isolation, but from a world where African kingship defined what it meant to mediate between God and man. To deny these roots is to deny the fullness of Israel's heritage, but to recover them is to see the story anew, that the sacred priesthood of Israel, the very foundation of its covenantal life, was born from the union of African bloodlines, African royal traditions, and African kings who stood as priests before the Most High.